till I introduce you to everybody, or do you know everybody on stage? Jeff Apter, everybody. Christine Paice. Karen. I knew it started with a big name. That is a true sign of my age because I introduced her this morning. Richard Glover, Debra, Oswald. Now what we're going to do, the format is, because this is a Readers Festival as opposed to a Writers Festival, you may have noticed that the only people who've talked have been people who write, but that is neither here nor there. What we decided to do is everybody gets, for around about 5 minutes, I'll cut them off after 5 minutes, to talk. We'll move progressively from Jeff through, then it's open to you. You can direct a question to somebody specifically, but I may decide that that's an inherently interesting question that I will move on to somebody else, right? So you may ask Richard, and I'll then say, yes, good, thanks Richard for that answer. Now Jeff, what do you think about it? That kind of thing. So that'll be the process. For those of you who have been wondering about the totally irrelevant title of this afternoon, which is, thank you, don't mention the F word. This is...
F is for forgetfulness.
This shows that I am well and truly in my dotage. This is a very funny story because it shows how small the actual community of writers is. Jeff and I shared an agent, a literary agent, and I decided that I had made a reasonable amount of money out of writing, and that what I would like to do, what I'd always wanted to do, was set up a small boutique publishing house for first-time fiction writers. And I walked into our shared agent and said, Fiona, can you help me? And she just looked at me and she said, don't mention the F word. And the F word is fiction. And the reason that she said that is you ask any agent and they will blanch at the prospect of trying to sell first fiction. And if you look at the actual statistics, the sales of non-fiction are so much more significant than they are of fiction. First fiction is really a very hard sell. So that's where that comes from, and you'll be amused to know, and this is how small the world is, Christine is now with that agent, and Karen is too. Karen is too, and Richard and Jeff share another agent. And so does Debra. Yeah. And yes, we no longer share Curtis Brown. But I'm sure these two will sing their praises. Okay, let's get started. Jeff.
I feel after that I should launch into song.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay, I mean, I looked at this, I've tried to approach this argument, fiction versus non-fiction, from a reader's and writer's perspective because I've been both. Interesting, at least to me, was when I was in my 20s and 30s, before I started writing for a living, I consumed way more fiction than I do today. I read it almost exclusively, mixing up literary fiction, contemporary fiction, some modern classics. I mean, over time, I guess I developed a real fondness for people such as Richard Ford, Kurt Vonnegut, Peter Carey, John Irving, Tom Robbins. Yet my reading was based around escape. I didn't like the job I had at the time, or jobs, and read to get away from the humdrum. Kind of a typical reader's outlook on why they consume what they do. I was dissatisfied personally and professionally. I guess it was a twist on that Woody Allen line from Annie Hall. You're always trying to get things to come out perfect in art, because it's real difficult in life. Well, I was doing that with my reading. Yet, once I became a professional writer, when I started writing for a living, my reading habits changed significantly. And I guess it's not insignificant that I became a biographer because bios became my reading staple. While I'd still try and read the new works of those writers I've mentioned before, my new go-to writers were vastly different people whose names might not be that familiar. Peter Gorownik, Barney Hoskins, and I started to read people like Hunter S. Thompson who blurred the lines between fiction and non-fiction. Although, speaking of him, I'm not sure what category you put him into at all. But the other thing is I found myself gravitating towards the non-fiction writing of novelists. I was much more likely to read, say, David Foster Wallace's writing about going on the campaign trail or spending time on a cruise liner or going to a state fair than I would be ever attempting to read Infinite Jest. I mean, I've read, there's a DT Max bio of Wallace, I've read it 3 times, still no Infinite Jest. It's never going to happen. But I love him as a non-fiction writer, even though he's a renowned novelist. So I'm sure that, I thought about it and thought, there's got to be a solid agenda at work here, obviously. I'm looking for good ideas that I can use in my own work. You know, basically stealing stuff. Borrowing. Did I say stealing? I said stealing. Yeah, borrowing. Searching for an idea or two I could incorporate into my own work. But I think even more crucially now, I read for inspiration for my own work. I mean, I just read the Ashley Wilson's bio of Brett Whiteley, which I think is just a fantastic piece of writing, irrespective of the fact that it's a biography, non-fiction, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just a really profound, stirring and engrossing piece of writing. And I read that and thought, if I could get anywhere near that with my own work, I've done a great job. And I haven't yet, but I'd really love to. It's good to have something from a writer now to aspire to. And that's the kind of thing that I think if I could come anywhere near, I'd be doing great work. Bruce asked in his notes about writing for an audience, which is a good question. To be honest, with my first half a dozen books, I was so intent in getting something readable on the page, I had no idea who I was writing for because I never thought I'd finish it in the first place. You know, quite frankly. It probably took me 10 books before I developed anything vaguely resembling a style. It was just, to me, at that point I'd come from magazine writing, and I thought it was just an extension of that. I found out quickly, I'm sure everybody's had this, the difference between 800 words and 80,000 is pretty significant.
It's a trifle.
It's a trifle. Yeah. The idea of thinking about an audience would have completely freaked me out. But over time, I've come to broadly grasp who my readers are, what they expect, but it doesn't have a massive influence on how I write. And I think I've developed a certain style and found an audience that appreciates it rather than trying to adapt to a certain expectation on the part of the reader. But to be honest, the strongest reaction from my audience is towards my topic of choice, not my writing, because music is such a subjective thing. You know, I've had people say to me, I loved your book on JOK, but there's no way I'm going to read about John Farnham, I don't like him. So it's really got nothing to do with how I write, it's the subject that I choose. And I'm fine with that, as long as there's a core of a few thousand readers out there that are going to buy something, and publishers tend to go along for the ride with you then. So basically my own evolution, if you call it that, has been from reading fiction for escape to reading non-fiction to be inspired. My motivation, it's not strictly personal, it's probably more professional now in what I read. I guess it goes to prove that both fiction and non-fiction have served a great purpose for me over my entire adult reading life. That's what I think.
Thank you.
This is an easy job for an MC. Christine?
Jeff said he had just done a 3.5-minute speech, so I might take that extra 1.5 minutes. I get 6.5. Okay. No one says to themselves when they're growing up, I want to be a non-fiction writer, except maybe Karl Marx. Everyone wants to write stories because fiction is the most beautiful thing. Fiction moves you, takes you to places you never dreamt existed, gives you people to love or hate or admire or envy. Fiction lifts you from your ordinary life to an extraordinary one, to a different world where you exist with your imagination before the real world brings you back. I was talking to a lady in Kiama, there's quite a few of them, and I said, so, you know, what are you, non-fiction or fiction? And she said, non-fiction. And she leaned towards me in a conspiratorial whisper and said, I'm only non-fiction because people give those books to me. I much prefer fiction. Dimock's top 101 books of all time have 93 fiction books and 8 non-fiction. Fiction wins with readers and with me because it's fiction I remember. Fiction I think about as I drive along or walk despairingly around Woolworths looking for pad thai sauce. What would Gollum do? He wouldn't bother buying the fish, he'd take the fish. Shopping like Gollum, that's my motto. If I was a non-fiction writer, I'd list the top 10 cereal brands that contain the most invisible sugar and write a book, How to Stop Invisible Sugar from Destroying Your Life. Thank you. I'm writing it. Fiction is a thought, an idea, a dream that becomes a story. It's a character who can do things you can't do, who loves the wrong person, does the wrong thing, because without the wrong things happening, how do we know what's right? Tim Winton says writing fiction is like pulling something from the air. So how does this work? By reading. Because by reading you learn to imagine, and by imagining you can change things. Reading fiction teaches empathy, seeing the world through another person's experience, and reading fiction, most importantly, teaches you how to write it. Now, some of you may know me, but I had better confess my literary DNA so you know where I'm coming from. I am the love child of John Keats, 19th century romantic poet, died when he was 26, believing in his own obscurity. And my mother, my literary mother, Christine de Pizan, born in the 14th century, lived in France, had 3 children, and was pretty much the first woman in Europe that we know of to make her living from writing. She wrote ballads and books celebrating women and a song in honour of Joan of Arc. I haven't done that yet. She was roughly 500 years older than Keats, so he was her toy boy, her plaything. And they had me. I was the middle daughter, named after my mother. My literary inheritance is lyric poetry and romantic fiction. They said, please don't write in any other genre. Poetry, but if you must write fiction, make sure it's poetry. So my pretend parents, the ones I grew up with and raised me, kept instructions from Keats and Christine de Pizan in a little wooden box in the living room. They said, don't let her watch television, don't have a television. So we lived at the end of a long dark street, and my sister and I had to walk from house to house and watch television through people's lace curtains until the people in the houses realised there were 2 kids there, and they'd turn around and go, what is the bloody Viggers' daughters, bugger off. Haven't finished Doctor Who, could you just put it back on? So no TV, plenty of books. And that began my lifelong devotion to literature, my need for reading. Enid Blyton, Agatha Christie, Narnia, everything. For me, fiction was real, and poetry made sense of the world. I didn't even actually know what, sorry Joe, non-fiction was. No one in our house read it except my father, who read T.S. Eliot, books about astronomy and God and spirituality, he was a vicar, and How to Grow Gooseberries, which my mother hated. The first non-fiction book I read was the Oxford English Dictionary, which had no plot, lots of meaning, and way too many endings. And then Robin Davidson's Tracks, which I loved but didn't make me want to walk across Australia with a string of camels of my own. The Word Ghost, my first novel, is partly autobiographical, but I deliberately decided I didn't want to write what actually happened. I got home late, Dad was cross, Mum was worried. So there are 2 ghosts. One is the Word Ghost, Algernon Keats, who is actually second cousin to my literary father, John Keats. And people are always asking me which bits are real, and I tell them that the ghosts are the only things in the book I didn't make up. It does have poetry in it, because I wanted to make it a little easier to sell, and I was obeying the wishes of my literary father and keeping myself in obscurity. Last year was the only time I could have written a non-fiction book, a parent's survival guide to the HSC. My answer to Eat, Pray, Love, called Cook, Drive, Worry, Drink. My first 2 lines, and they're the only 2 lines I've ever written. I found myself sobbing on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, and I said to myself, don't worry, Christine, get up and have a drink. Oh look, I've got another little page. Okay. Won't be long. So I read non-fiction for research. For fiction, I read fiction for love and curiosity. And I was going to tell you all the books I have on my desk, but I won't. And I'll leave you with a quote from Alistair McGrath on C.S. Lewis that for me sums up being a fiction writer. It is possible for the weak and foolish to have a noble calling in a dark world. Thank you.
This is the easiest MC job I've got, except I think she went over her 5 minutes.
I did.
But by the time we get to it, poor Debra, she's going to be very short-changed. Right, can you short, sharp and succinct Karen?
Well, there endeth the scripted speakers, unfortunately, so now you have to listen to me. Yeah, I didn't write anything scripted because I was busy working as a vet yesterday and then driving down to Kiama. But it's interesting that you mentioned Fiona, the agent, Fiona English from Curtis Brown, because when I first went to her, when I first sent her my first novel, she didn't mention the F word being a bad word or anything like that, but she said, thank goodness I hadn't written a novella or short stories, which I think's or poetry, which I think's really sad because I enjoy reading all of those different types, but she said we can't sell them. And she also said, thank goodness you hadn't, because I said, I haven't done any writing courses. And she said, well, thank goodness you haven't done one of those because people come out a little like clones, which is a generalisation, definitely. But yeah, I was too timid as a fledgling writer to do a writer's course. I thought if someone criticised my bold work that I was attempting to do, that I would fall in a crumpled heap and never write again. But I'd come from a science writing background, had written all my life, but I did a PhD in wildlife health, and I felt that that was my learning ground for editing and accepting criticism. So that was useful. But as far as my reading preferences go, I would read fiction all the time. I love fiction, but I read equally, and I do love non-fiction too. I read them for different reasons. So I read a lot of both fiction and non-fiction. I would read a lot more fiction if I could, but when I'm writing my fiction, which is contemporary fiction, threaded with the past and threaded with history, I have to do a lot of non-fiction reading, as those who came to my talk this morning would have heard, as the sort of foundation upon which to build my story and to understand my characters. Because one of the things I like to write about is the past and how it reaches into the present and into the future and makes us who we are. So my reading of fiction is for my enjoyment and to be inspired by great writers, of course, but I love reading non-fiction as well, so I enjoy the best of both worlds. It was interesting you mentioned that non-fiction outsells fiction. I think it's 3-1 or something like that. However, in the ebook world, I did a bit of research last night and this morning. In the ebook world, fiction outsells non-fiction 8-1 currently, and that makes up, I think, about 25% of book sales these days. It hasn't grown recently, which I think is interesting, because there was this, the death of the book and the death of the hard copy that was discussed widely. But now apparently the physical book is going through a resurgence. I don't own a Kindle or any e-reader. I've never only recently done my first reading on an e-reader, and that was for the Kiama Readers Festival when I had to interview Nick Earls, and the only way they could give me his novellas was in an e-book format. I would much have preferred to hold the physical book. I like the smell and the feel, and I don't care how big or heavy it is. I want to go to bed with a real book.
Or a friend who's read one.
We won't take that any further. Not up here anyway. A lot of people say, well, I want to read non-fiction because they're real stories, whereas fiction isn't real and you just make it up. Now, of course, there's an element of made up in fiction, but to me, often the way that we explore character and story is in fact much more real and more alive for me in fiction than it is in non-fiction. And as I said, I love to read non-fiction, but often to me it feels like wading. Whereas when I think for fiction, for me, is the beauty of it is in the crafting of the story and the crafting of the words. And not to say that non-fiction writers don't craft those things as well, but there's some beautiful, and the writing as well that comes into the fiction. for me. One thing that's really interesting from a reader's perspective, I think, is that when Bruce was asking before, do you keep the reader in mind, is that all of us as writers would love to write the next international bestseller. But if you sit down, I think, as a writer and then think, right, I'm going to write the bestseller, what sort of book is going to sell, what is selling at the moment? When I've tried to think like that, everything has died for me. I think as a writer, you can only write what is strong and deep and passionate inside you. And whether that be fiction or non-fiction, they're the books that possibly are going to sell, or not. So it's interesting because one of my books that's best known in Australia, called The Lightkeeper's Wife, was a bestseller in Australia. But for some reason, unbeknownst to me, and with which I had nothing to do with it, the book was sold into France, and it's going crazy over there. Has sold 250,000 copies in the last 5 months. And I've had nothing to do with that. I haven't gone out talking at readers' festivals. I haven't written anything for newspaper articles.
We're going to kill her.
And it's not boasting. And nothing to do with going to bed with someone who's read a book. But
She's also won a prize for that book as well.
But look, I mean, that's wonderful. It's really exciting, but it feels really remote, and I'm just a normal person in Australia struggling to get a recognition in my own country. But that's normal, I think. I don't know where I was heading with this. But people often have said to me when I talk to readers groups and to book clubs and things like that, they've said, oh, why don't you should write about yourself as well. They say you should write about yourself, and I think, well, that's really scary for me. I think I can be more honest in my fiction than I could be sitting to write about my own life. I've done wonderful, exciting things like go to Antarctica, working on animals, and work with a whole range of Australian wildlife in their natural habitats, and been and visited many countries. But the personal parts of my life I wouldn't want to share, whereas I can explore and delve into personal issues, some of which may be my own, but you will never know, in my fiction, in a much more honest way than I ever would in non-fiction. So to finish up with, who do I write for? When I first sit down to write, I'm writing for myself because it has to come from within me. But then when I start the crafting of the story and developing the characters and bringing them more to life and getting to know their backstories, then I'm starting to write more for you, the readers, and to bring the story to life for you and thread it in a way that will make you want to keep reading. Okay, thank you.
Over to you, Richard.
Look, I think you can find what I'm going to talk about in both fiction and non-fiction, but mainly you find it in fiction. And I think what I've always found most attractive about reading is the loss of self, actually, which might seem an odd thing to say. To lose yourself in something. I remember really early on in my reading career being about 13 years old and sitting on the side of the school oval in Canberra on my own reading P.G. Woodhouse. An image does form, I know. And then I was reading about Gussie Finknottle and the Drones Club and all of that, and Bertie and Jeeves, and some sort of big gangling thug came along and stomped on my Penguin paperback. And influenced perhaps by my reading material, I jumped up and said, "You can't do that, you blighter." He punched me so hard I fell to the ground, which was probably reasonable, since this was the only known usage of the word blighter in the 1970s school year. But it's a measure of how much I'd lost myself. That rather troubled teenager who had all the weight of the world on his shoulders was entirely absent. I was entirely in the Strand, walking down to the Drones Club with Gussie Finknottle. And that's why I reacted like that. I was no longer who I was. And I think that's such an incredibly valuable thing. It always has been. It maybe is even more so today. One of the things I think about social media, which is a great thing and a positive thing, but you think about Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, not only for kids, but for everybody, for us as well. And in a way, you build these universes where you are the sun in the middle, and all the planets revolve around you, and everybody likes the same bands and the same politicians, and most of the discussion, in fact, is about your shared parties and who's dating who, and it's all intensely narcissistic. intensely narcissistic. And the one thing about, I've always thought the one thing about self-love is it's so rarely reciprocated. It always turns nasty, doesn't it? It always turns inward on oneself. And that's the great liberation of the book. You go into a different world and you leave yourself behind, and you no longer become the sun in the middle of this swirling universe. It's this great freedom from anxiety and stress and neuroticism. And all. It's very similar to nature in that. I think that the two things that can do that for you is nature and books. And it's an amazing thing. I think if you remember back to when you had fights with your parents or something as a kid, you would either go and climb up a tree, or you'd go and throw yourself into a book. And it's this amazing transformative, empathy was the word you used, but I think that's a really central word about good reading, is it's this gymnasium for empathy. It's how we strengthen our empathy muscles. There's an amazing scene in, I don't know if anyone's read Anna Karenina recently, but there's an amazing scene in that where she's run off with Vronsky, and the husband's told her that she's got to send back the 12-year-old boy. And she's sort of heartbroken by this idea that she's going to lose her son. And she thinks to herself, oh, I know, I'll tell Vronsky about what I'm going through. And the instant she forms that idea in her mind, she instantly understands that if she did say that to Vronsky, this dismissive look would pass across his face, because he didn't really care. He doesn't really care. And she knew in that, and she understands in that minute how little he really loves her, how much she's lost through this affair, and how the whole thing is terrible. And it's about 3 lines of prose. And the thing is, about 3/4 of the way through the book, and she's a foreign aristocrat, really, from a different century and a different time and a different social class to all of us. She's not even that attractive a character, actually. And yet, at that point, after these 3 lines of prose, as a reader, you just want to hug her, you just want to hold her tight. The wave of empathy is so intense, and you're so entirely walking in her shoes. And that's the great part. And of course that can happen in some non-fiction. It happens sometimes in memoir, for instance. But it's really at its most intense when it's in fiction. And that's what's so incredibly valuable about it. The only other thing I can say about Anna Karenina is that I always think that someone should do a version set in New South Wales, because it would end really well, because the train would never arrive.
Now I have to follow that. That's not. This is a plea for sympathy. Please, come on. Look, having gone last, I do feel like, can I just kind of commandeer the wisdom and jokes that everyone else has said? I agree with everything everybody else has said. The one thing I know that occurs to me sitting here is there's a play of mine for kids called Stories in the Dark, and it's about folk tales. It's about kids trapped in the siege of Sarajevo, and in the night when there's no light and the little boy's scared, they tell each other stories to get through the night, and in the day they read folk tales, so they've got a story to tell at night. And for that, I got to pursue my lifelong interest in folk tales, and there's huge numbers of them that you can read. And there's so many of them that crop up in so many different centuries and different cultures that could never have had any contact with each other. Like, for example, there's one that I use in the play that's the singing bones story, the idea of someone has been killed unjustly and their body is buried, and years later somebody finds the bones, a passerby finds the bones and digs them up and makes a musical instrument out of the bones, like a harp from a chest bone or a flute from a leg bone. And when you play the instruments, it sings the truth of what happened to that person. I just think it's such an extraordinary idea. Like, it makes me go chilling just thinking of it now. And that story crops up in so many different cultures, in Native American, Japanese, Celtic, huge number of others. And I think that what's exciting about that is the idea that there are certain story shapes that human beings vibrate to. We're kind of built to respond to story. And so that's something that I do when I write, in all the different forms that I write. I'm always thinking, what is the classic story shape that this wants to be? And it would be arrogant and foolish of me to ignore that. you know, because there are reasons why we respond to certain story set shapes. And obviously you have to find a way to tell that freshly. But to me, there's a kind of, I mean, I love non-fiction, and I think non-fiction is incredibly powerful, and there are people who do it superbly and with enormous compassion and humanity and so forth. It doesn't have to be, you know, come sort of a dry research exercise in the right hands. But what I like about fiction is that it's a way to sort of talk about mysteries that aren't accessible to facts and logic necessarily, that have their, I mean, as you said, there's their own kind of truths. Just at a more trivial level, there's a fashion at the moment, because I write television, I write fiction and theatre and TV drama, and there's been a bit of a fashion lately in Australian television for mini-series about real people, you know, those biopics, and I always think it's funny because the ones where you know the real story, you know how much has been left out, so they could get the rights to the music, for example. And so there's a funny idea about, there's a friend of ours whose father said that he didn't want to read fiction because it was just lies. As if this was some sort of trick that we were all playing on him, just trying to feed him a bunch of lies. I think sometimes in some kinds of memoir there's a lot of self-serving going on, so it's kind of duplicitous. In a lot of these mini-series about, you know, real people supposedly based on real history, there's so many things, not falsehood, but so many things left out that the overall impression is, I would argue, you can actually tell the truth a lot more effectively sometimes in fiction. I always have an audience in mind when I'm writing whatever I'm writing. The difference, because I jump between the media, the difference is that in theatre you have the extraordinary experience of being in a room with 300 people engaging with your story in front of you, laughing, gasping, hopefully not getting bored, whatever experience they're having. Can you imagine, that's like rocket fuel. If you've written that story, to hear people responding to your characters in front of you is fantastic. With television, you get a little bit of a sense of that, you follow the Twitter feed, whatever. The trouble with fiction is, unless I break into your homes when you're reading one of my books, if you feel breath on your shoulder, it's me. Because I'm all the time as I'm writing imagining, how will this land in somebody's head? How will this make them feel? Will this make sense? Whatever. And of course, you don't get the chance to do that as a writer of prose. So it's one of the nice things about writing drama, that you get to kind of be there with you when the story lands in your head. So I'm a great believer in the power of story. Sort of connected to what Richard was saying, I do think there's so much opinion in the world. There's so much, everyone's walking around chock full of opinion, and there's so many things that are asking us to respond with opinion. And we've got this little sort of crust of opinionatedness around us. And what I like about fiction is that sometimes it can kind of sneak in around that and kind of make you... My favourite moment as a writer is when an audience judges a character harshly with all the opinions that they... You know when you sit down in a theatre and you've got opinions about how somebody's behaving, or you open a book and you've got opinions, and then the story makes you... Some of the crust falls off and you respond to that person very differently, and someone that you thought you would never, and that if you met them in real life you would never like, but because the story has sort of entranced you, you respond with a little bit less judgment about people. That's the heart. I mean, that's the dream, that we can do that. Not always. Anyway.
I almost feel my job's over.
Bruce, can I add a funny...
you can definitely
code to
go
that
for
story.
it.
I was once sitting on a train, and there was someone sitting in front of me reading, I think it was a magazine article I'd written, right? And I had that exact moment where I was breathing down their neck. And it was a young woman, and I leant over and I said, I wrote that. And she looked at me, looked at the... because there was no photo byline, it was a magazine article, and moved into the next scene.
So just remember, it's a really bad chat-up line that doesn't work. Questions? Anybody to anybody? Just raise your hand. I love this. Whenever you ask for questions, you never get a hand. Then some brave person puts their hand up. And from that moment onwards, we're going to be inundated. Terrific. Here we go. You're going to have to accept that I'm going to take time getting around.
Hi, I was wondering, as writers, what was your reaction to Bob Dylan being receiving
My reaction was, Joe Dolce, snubbed again.
Yeah, don't get me started.
Well, as this is, don't mention the F word, my reaction to Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature is I effing loved it.
Yeah, lyrics are poetry as well. Though my husband always tells a funny story about an interview he heard on radio. Wasn't one of yours, where Bob Dylan was being interviewed and somebody said, "Oh, where did you come up with that really meaningful line? Like, that was incredible, incredibly deep." And he said, "It rhymed with the line before."
I think it's fine, but I really think they've got to give it to Philip Roth before he dies.
Yes, yes. And let it, well, actually, if you really want an argument, Joni Mitchell long before Bob Dylan.
It opens the floodgates, doesn't it? It really does. Giving Dylan the Nobel Prize for Literature really opens the floodgates for, who's next? As you say, Lenny Carl, Joni Mitchell.
I'll argue that Joni Mitchell's a better poet. But we've got better things to do this afternoon. Another question. Yeah. No more questions about Bob Dylan.
When you set out to write a book, is there a limited number of words by publicity?
I was going to say, yeah, that would not. You can do the non-fiction bit in a minute. Apparently, when you write fiction, the publishers are looking for around 100,000 words. So when my first novel went to said agent, it was 150,000 words, and her first comment was, "How good are you with a red pen?" Fortunately, I had my husband's a scientist and very good at editing, and I had previously been subjected to his red pen, so I was quite good myself at going through and saying, "Is this essential to the plot? Can I cut it?" But I'm really scared at the moment because I've just sent my latest novel to my publisher, and we're not going to tell her that it's currently 140,000 words and see what happens.
I think it's an interesting question for Richard, who periodically puts together the columns from the Sydney Morning Herald. Do they tell you how many? Or, in theory, could you give them the last 3 years?
Yeah, well, you wouldn't though. I mean, I think books are too long often. There's especially a terrible habit in America with non-fiction. I think where you look at this book and you think, well, I'm quite interested in Lyndon Baines Johnson actually, but I don't want to read 3,000 pages on him. I would like to read a properly edited 400-page book on Lyndon Johnson. Thank you very much. And there's a lot of books like that, I think, which are just simply too long. I suppose fiction's a little bit different because sometimes when you're in a 400-page book, I mentioned Anna Karenina, you're actually, you want it to go on forever. But I think any good writer can benefit from taking 10%, or at least having a really good attempt at taking 10% out of your manuscript. And really, I'm sure we've all had the experience of taking 30,000 words out of a manuscript, to be honest. Nearly everybody who's written a proper book has lopped off the first 4 chapters and thrown them in the bin, or the last 4 chapters, or the middle 10 chapters. And it's all, one of my favourite quotes about writing is Thomas Mann, who said, "Writing is a craft for people who find writing difficult." Like, it should feel really difficult and really hard, and you should win every word and try really hard to knock out every word you possibly can. This is Debra and I live together, and we fight for some years, for 35 years, when we were both writing, we really fight over who gets to take all the dishes out of the dishwasher or put the laundry on the line, because you're so sick of being at your desk. It's such a painful process. You want to do housework. And I always think, it took Flaubert 7 years to write Sentimental Education, but you should have seen his shower recesses.
I certainly know from someone writing, mass market, mainstream non-fiction, my directives are always very clear. It's always 80,000, between 70 and 80,000 words, and you've got to write to not exceed the concentration span of someone on the beach during their summer holiday. That's true. That's true. I was told that very clearly, and I think it's not a bad rule of thumb if you're writing the type of books that I write. If the audience know.
Well,
Which beach?
well, let me just say, for poetry, when I write a poem, if I'm over 26 lines, it's gone too far. You can get into a rhythm of what you write. I mean, and normally 26 lines is my normal limit, and if it's very, very long, then often I will just find myself and it's only got 26 lines of meaning. So it's a struggle.
Because I'm so afraid of boring people. My first draft, well, the book that Penguin published last year, they said we want you to add 20,000 words to it, which was weird. I think it's partly for me that I'm so not interested in description. When there's too many descriptions of clouds and trees, I skip and wait till people start talking to each other and doing things. You know, so I keep the descriptions of clouds to a minimum. So I had to put some cloud descriptions back.
Another question here.
I have just watched the first episode of House of Cards, and I would like to ask if you think the Trump saga will be made into a film.
Absolutely, for sure. I mean, if you'd like to take a bet, I will cash in, for sure. I mean, our son said that American Politics is like a mini-series and we're up to season 9, and that's when things start to go awry.
I did yesterday, and I will later this afternoon. I argue that, you know, there was a debate some years ago about the great Australian novel and the great American novel, and it's quite unambiguous to me that the great American novel is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and you can still find in that, and I put it up on Facebook yesterday and I put it up this afternoon, quotes that are absolutely essence of the Trump campaign. I mean, the Duke and the King, for those who are familiar with it, the Duke and the King are Trump, and there's no question about it. Drunk Pat Finn furiously declaring that he's not going to vote because they let a nigger vote sounds like every Trump supporter I've ever heard. So, yes, it probably has already been written. Next question.
I was rather saddened that I think it was you who said that novellas are very difficult to place. Yes, that's right. And does this mean that, I mean, I've just read Anna Funder's Girl with the Dogs, and it's a novella and it's great. I mean, are they worried that, you know, they're using less paper for one, but all the work going into a novella is obviously far similar to a whole. So what do you think what's the reason?
Well, I mean, you were saying you did. Nick Earls just published a set of 5 novellas that are kind of linked, like they kind of hook around, and they're really fantastic, aren't they? And and each one is like this really juicy morsel of story, and there's nothing wasted, and they're exactly as long as they need to be. So it would be a shame if we can't. They are also $20 each for these little.
Yeah, they're the same price.
No, seriously.
But they're then going to put them all into one book called The Wisdom Tree, and I think the novella is an underrated form, and we wouldn't have The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway these days, you know, because of the... Oh yeah, Heart of Darkness as well. Like, there's fantastic novellas out there in the world, but I think the publishing world, you know, is very nervous about constant discussion about lifting of parallel import restrictions, which will bring a flood of books from overseas. They may be cheaper into Australia, but I think, you know, when you talk about the cheap book, you then have to think about the impact on content that's going to be available for you readers, which will be a lot less of Australian content and more of the big names that you already know from overseas. So have to start thinking about, you know, is it the cost? I don't want to get into that necessarily into that argument unless you want to start to look at it. But yeah, we need to continue producing beautiful novellas, and Nick Earls are a fantastic example of that.
Another question over here.
It's actually on that exact point about parallel imports and copyright changes. There's been lots of attention from the media about this, which I think is terrible for the Australian publishing industry. How can we, as passionate readers, because we wouldn't be here otherwise, save Australian stories?
I can say that because I can talk about my sales, which are not as good as yours. Because I think my book's quite a good example of why this matters. I've published about 12 books with HarperCollins, and they've all sold okay, just okay. And some of them, I would say they've actually lost money on, they've sold so few. And then there's finally this last book that I published recently has finally done well. So they've been investing in me, in a sense, for 20 years, and they've finally got this one book which has probably paid back all the money that they've spent on me over all that time. And under this new system, and the book is now with a lot of American publishers, and they're considering it, and hopefully one of them will publish it. And in theory, anyway, under the new rules, that American, Dimmicks here or someone, could go to that American publisher, and let's say HarperCollins is selling the book for $25. They could say, well, you sell it to us for $24 and we'll buy it direct from you, from America. And they would be allowed to do that under the new laws. So you often wouldn't actually save much money, I don't think. The book might be the Stephen... this is even aside from the Stephen King books, which are obviously they're going to buy from someone who's printed 300,000 of them in America, and they'll buy them really cheaply and bring them over here. They only have to buy them for 10 cents cheaper than they can produce them here, and it's going to be the interest of the booksellers to buy them from the American or the Canadian supplier. But even with Australian authors, then it gets sold to America. The American publisher essentially supplies the Australian market, and so this publisher who's invested in me for 20 years gets nothing back. So why are they going to invest in the next person who comes along? And there's very few countries in the world that do this. There are only really 2 countries which are similar to us, and it's Canada and New Zealand. HarperCollins, for instance, the office in New Zealand is half the size that it was 5 years ago before the laws were changed. So they've got half the editors, half the publishers, and they publish half as many books. And the price doesn't really come down. And in Canada, they say, all the mathematics textbooks and all the biology textbooks, all the textbooks now used in Canadian schools are all American. Because you can buy them, because it's a mass market, they've already printed 500,000 copies of biology today. It's going to be cheaper to import them into Canada, which is exactly what happens. Destruction of both industries, and that's what's going to happen to ours. The Productivity Commission has recommended this to the government having asked for it, and it really is important that people put pressure on their local members and sign. There's petitions going around. Let's put one up on the Kiama Readers Festival Facebook page in case you want to follow the links. But it really is an existential threat to Australian writing and Australian reading.
And the idea that the Productivity Commission would even consider that in an author's lifetime you would lose a copyright to your works is just outrageous. Copyright in Australia currently expires, I think, 70 or 75 years after the author's death. Well, the Productivity Commission were considering making copyright, reducing it to 15 or 20 years. So I thought it was 15 was the bottom line, but the idea that your intellectual property, which takes you many years to create and many years to write and many years to publish, would then no longer be yours or your family's or your children's or part of an inheritance, or even if like the woman who's written There's a Hippopotamus on My Roof Eating Cake, took her 38 years from when her book was published for it to be made into a musical. Now, if those copyright laws came in, she wouldn't have access to any rights for this musical. And so I think it's outrageous that the Productivity Commission has no real idea of what the creative industries are about. They look at it as an industry for product and for profit, and it's completely wrong. They don't understand the creative process. And there's no support for creative professionals within that idea, certainly not from the government or George bloody Brandis anyway.
That's not actually his middle name.
Richard, your comments before segued into my question. Being a Rusted on 2BL listener, I had to buy and read your latest book. I cried, I laughed. It was just such an intensely moving book, and I keep asking myself, how do you decide to let us into so much of your life? How do you decide to put it on paper?
Yeah, so it has got some revealing things in it, I guess. And look, I think the challenge with all these things is the story doesn't make sense unless you're honest, actually. So unless you're brutally honest about all the things, the story, these real life stories don't make sense. They don't compute really unless you are incredibly frank about everything. And the whole joy of writing, you know, I think people sometimes imagine that good writing is about choosing a fancy word or, you know, an unusual expression or something. And it's not really. I think it's about trying to pin reality to the board. You know, I love, one of my favourite writers is Helen Garner, and she lets you see that paragraph by paragraph. It's very exciting to read because she'll say the policeman, I can't do her justice, but she'll say the policeman walked into the room like, well, actually, it wasn't quite like that. It was, and you can see her kind of fighting for the right way to describe this, the way this guy moved or the feeling he gave off, and she'll finally arrive at it. And she shows you her workings, you know, it's great. But and to the extent that it is fantastic writing. It's fantastic writing not because she's aiming to do fantastic writing. It's fantastic writing because she's just being so desperately keen to be accurate, to capture the moment. And I think that's what, you know, so I'm not really, when I'm writing, I'm not thinking, God, this is a bit much. I'm just thinking, how can I be as truthful as I can to what happened? So that's the motivator, and the sort of revelatory things are really not in the front of your mind, I think.
Questions? I thought for 1 minute that we'd actually brought you to a halt. The truth of that observation of Richard's can be seen brilliantly in Hilary Mantel's writing. You look at that, I mean, it's a model of the way to write historic fiction. She's so deeply involved, but every line and every sentence is so carefully constructed to be true and to be powerfully true. So if you haven't read it, which I'm sure everybody has, do so.
Hello, I'd be interested in the panel's observations about blogs, because a lot of people read blogs nowadays, and yet they circumvent the editor, and I'm sure you appreciate the work that the editor does for your in helping review your copy, and yet so many people, you know, there's so many sites out there about, you know, make money writing a blog and blog. Anyone can blog in a blog now, learn to blog in 2 days and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And it's a new form of writing, and some people do it really well, but other people do it really badly. And all they're trying to do is make money through the advertising side of things. So I'd just be interested in your views on that form of writing.
It's the death of writing. It really is.
Tell us what you really feel.
I swear, because it's so hard to build a career as a writer, to see people become instant writers, you know, and that extends into other fields too, and it's a great frustration for me. You know, it's taken me 15 years to get to a point where I feel like I'm established, and to see people because of certain, say, celebrity, or they write a cookbook or something, they suddenly become author. I find that very insulting. I love the process of working with a good editor. I love nothing more than having someone who's invested their energy and time into my work to make it better. And maybe that's a strictly commercial thing, but it's also a creative relationship. And when you get a good editor, I can't imagine how anybody could write in total isolation, like a blogger, and feel like they've produced their best work. That's generally, I mean, that's why I'm a fan of old-fashioned books, because I think that old-fashioned process that's been in place for so long, the writer and the editor relationship, and also the relationship of the writer with the designer. Get involved in the production of, you know, how your book looks. Does it reflect what you're trying to say?
I don't think as a writer you don't have a choice in how it's designed.
Oh, I do, absolutely. I make it part of my contract that I actually have involvement in cover design and all those kind of things.
Yes, I do too.
Do it, because I think I think...
Why do you think Jeff's name is so big on
It's such a nuisance, you know. I write about all these celebrities and they get in the way, you know.
I always thought that book was John Farnham about you.
That pretty much sums it up, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I have a blog that I write in my mind called Paice blog. It's a really intense literary blog, but I've never actually written it. I just think it, and I think it's probably better that it stays in my mind, because I review all the books I read, and some of them are kind and some of them are wonderful, and I just decide I won't commit to blogging because it's just a waste of my time, basically, and I'm always too busy writing.
I don't even have time to read blogs.
Okay, I will say one little thing. I think the other thing about it, this is as a journalist more, that the one problem is it's all opinion, and opinion's fine, but the world is, as Debra was saying, the world is not short of opinion. What the world is short of is Kate McClymont, you know, and that's where, you know, it is a shame that readers are being dragged away from mainstream newspapers. Mainstream newspapers are going broke, they can't afford investigative journalism, there's no one really ever to... And not only investigative journalism, just fact-based journalism. Journalism where it doesn't have to be investigative, just journalism which will go down to state parliament, go to the courts, try to produce a fact-based story on the South Australian power outages to give you the information you need. And blogs never do that, because, well, very rarely do that, because people don't have the time and the skill and the effort. All they've got time for is to sit down with a glass of whiskey and say, oh, that Baird is an idiot, or that Baird is a saint, you know. And the world is enough of that, is what I think.
My question relates a little bit to the last question. Given that 10 years ago every commuting train was full of people reading newspapers or novels, today they're full of people reading mobile phones. How is that changing? I'm curious as to how that's changing. How is the publishing and writing industry responding to that? I suppose that's going to be the way people read going forward.
Yeah, book sales are not down. It's really you know, I've forgotten who it was now, but one of a Labor minister, who was it, 5 years ago, said the independent books sector in Australia will be dead in 10 years, he predicted. And that has really not been the case. It's true that a couple of chains closed is what caused him to say it. Borders and Angus and Robertson both closed down. But since that happened, which is now 6 years ago maybe, there's been nary a closure of an independent bookstore across the country. Some of them, like Paice and Mossman, are doing brilliantly at the moment. Some of them are value-adding a little by having events like this, and that's been a good thing. But book sales are quite resilient. As was said, e-books, not that there's anything wrong with e-books, by the way, but it is interesting to note that even the e-book thing has absolutely stabilised at about 20% of the literary market, maybe 25% generally, and 0 of the children's market is e-book. So books are really still very valued, and they're selling quite strongly around the world, and the independent booksellers, you know, market has basically stabilised. So the news is kind of good, actually.
Do you know the proliferation of events like this? There's something that I thought was really interesting, is that there's constant talk, you know, from people close to publishing about the death of publishing, but events like these, and particularly regional writers and readers festivals, is amazing. I mean, look at this. I'm sitting in a room talking to a couple of hundred people. It's very rare to see a couple of hundred people gather in my local Dimmicks, I can assure you. So there seems to be some weird contrast between the development of things like this, and I mean, there's events at Batemans Bay, there's events at Goulburn, and all up and down the coast, which are fantastic. So people are still reading, for sure. People are definitely still reading.
But as Karen says, the artefact of a book, what a book actually is, the cover, it's tactile, you pick it up, you touch it, you feel it, you don't need electricity to run it. If there's a power cut, you can still light a candle and read. You'll have a book for years, you'll write in it, you'll stain it, you'll weep over it. It becomes, it's an object that's part of your life. And I love my old books, I love my old notes, I love all the rude, terrible things I wrote in the margins. I think, you know, books are here forever, and events like this really help promote them. And so you can read on your mobile phone or on your device, and you can flick your screens, and you can do all your doodles, whatever you do, but nothing, for me, ever replaces a book.
And isn't that the perfect place to be? Christine has delivered, I told her, that's the final word, and she delivered perfectly. These people will all be outside, I hope, for you to go and buy all their books and get them to sign every one of them. So suddenly, oh no, they're all there. So please, thank you very much. I hope it's been an enjoyable and fruitful day for everybody. What's that? I'm not part of the committee, by the way. People keep on thinking I'm part of it. I would like, on behalf of everybody who is here, to thank the volunteers who have come and been wonderful. The gentleman up the back who's done the audio. The wonderful women who have opened and shut those doors on the side. The people who have looked after the talent who has come, and particularly Michelle, our local librarian, who has spent, I believe, 18 months trying to put this together. So, congratulations to the committee, to the volunteers, to the talent. Thank you very much.